I was on my way out for my husband's funeral when my grandson ran into the garage, pale and sobbing. He threw himself in front of the car. "Grandma, don't start the engine. Please, don't start it." I was in shock. "What's happening?" "Just trust me. We're leaving on foot, now." Minutes later, my children started calling nonstop. "Don't answer," he pleaded. I heard them talking about, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Phyllis, and I never thought the day of my husband's funeral would become the day I discovered how little my own children valued my life." I was standing in our garage, keys trembling in my hand as I stared at Roman's black sedan. The same car he'd driven for 12 years, the same car that still smelled like his cologne, and the peppermints he always kept in the center console. Today, I was supposed to drive it to his funeral alone because my children had insisted on taking separate cars to handle logistics. I should have known something was wrong when they were so eager to leave without me. The funeral was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and it was already 10:30. I'd spent the morning getting dressed in the navy blue dress Roman had always loved, the one he said made my eyes look brighter. My hands shook as I applied lipstick, trying to look presentable for the dozens of people who would be watching me say goodbye to the only man who'd ever truly loved me. We'd been married for 38 years. 38 years of shared dreams, quiet Sunday mornings, and the kind of love that grows deeper with time rather than fading. Roman had been my anchor, my best friend, my everything. The cancer took him so quickly that I barely had time to process what was happening before he was gone. I pressed the garage door opener and watched as sunlight flooded the concrete floor. The day was beautiful, which felt like a cruel joke. How could the sun shine so brightly on the worst day of my life? I walked around to the driver's side, my black heels clicking against the floor. My purse felt heavy on my shoulder, weighed down by tissues I knew I'd need, and the reading glasses I'd have to use to read the program. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were running, fast and frantic. I turned just as my 16-year-old grandson Dean burst through the door that connected the garage to the house. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide with terror. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he sprinted toward me. "Grandma, don't start the car," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Please don't start the engine." Before I could react, he threw himself in front of the car, pressing his back against the hood like he was trying to shield it from me. His whole body was shaking, and he was sobbing so hard he could barely catch his breath. "Dean, what on earth?" I started, but he cut me off. "Don't get in the car, Grandma, please. We have to leave on foot. Right now." I stared at him, completely bewildered. Dean had always been a sensitive boy, more thoughtful and caring than his father, my eldest son, Michael, but I'd never seen him like this. Never seen him so terrified that he could barely speak. "Sweetheart, what's happening?" I asked, moving toward him. "The funeral starts in 30 minutes. We can't walk there, it's 7 miles away." "We're not going to the funeral," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't go. Grandma, you have to trust me. Something terrible is going to happen if you start this car." My heart began to race. Dean wasn't the type of boy to make up stories or cause drama. He was mature for his age, responsible, the kind of teenager who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and never missed his homework. If he was this scared, something was genuinely wrong. "Dean, you're frightening me," I said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Tell me what's going on." He glanced toward the house, his eyes darting to the windows like he was afraid someone might be watching us. Then he grabbed my hand, his fingers ice cold despite the warm morning. "I heard them talking," he whispered. "Dad and Aunt Sarah and Uncle David. They were in the kitchen this morning while you were getting dressed. They thought I was still asleep, but I came downstairs early because I couldn't sleep." My other 2 children, Sarah and David, had both stayed at the house last night to help with arrangements. They'd insisted it would be easier for everyone to leave from here together, though they'd changed their minds about riding together at the last minute. "What did they say?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Dean's face crumpled and fresh tears spilled over his cheeks. They were talking about you, Grandma, about what would happen after today. And then Dad said something about making sure you don't make it to the funeral. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the car to steady myself. That can't be right, honey. You must have misunderstood. I didn't misunderstand, he said, his voice rising with desperation. Dad said they needed to make it look like an accident, that you were too grief-stricken to drive safely. Uncle David said something about the brakes, and Aunt Sarah laughed. She actually laughed, Grandma. The garage seemed to spin around me. My own children talking about harming me? It was impossible. Yes, we'd had our differences over the years, especially since Roman got sick. They'd been impatient with the medical expenses, frustrated with how much time his care was taking, annoyed that I wouldn't consider putting him in a facility, but planning to hurt me? Dean, are you absolutely certain about what you heard? I asked, my voice barely steady. He nodded vigorously. I recorded some of it on my phone, he said, pulling the device from his pocket with shaking hands. I couldn't get it all, but I got enough. Grandma, they want you dead. The word dead hung in the air between us like a physical presence. My knees felt weak, and I had to lean against the car to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not ever. My phone began to ring from inside my purse. The sharp sound made both Dean and me jump. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. Michael's name flashed on the screen. Don't answer it, Dean said quickly, moving closer to me. Please, Grandma. They're probably wondering where you are. They expected you to be gone by now. The phone rang again, the sound echoing off the garage walls. Then it stopped, only to start ringing again immediately. This time it was Sarah calling. They're getting worried, Dean whispered. We need to go. Now. I stared at the phone in my hand, watching as David's name appeared for the third call in less than 2 minutes. My children, the babies I'd carried, nursed, loved unconditionally for decades, were calling to check if their plan to kill me had worked. Where can we go? I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. There's a coffee shop about 6 blocks away, Dean said. We can figure things out there, but we have to leave right now, before they come looking for you. I looked at Roman's car one more time, thinking about all the trips we'd taken in it, all the memories we'd made. Then I thought about what Dean had told me, and I felt something I'd never felt before when thinking about my children. Fear. Okay, I said, closing my purse and taking Dean's arm. Let's go. As we walked toward the street, leaving the garage door open and the car sitting there like evidence of a crime that never happened, my phone rang again. This time, all 3 of my children were calling in succession, over and over, their names flashing across my screen like accusations. Don't answer, Dean pleaded again, and I didn't. But as we hurried down the sidewalk, putting distance between ourselves and the house where I'd raised a family that apparently wanted me dead, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If they'd planned this for today, what else had they been planning? And how long had my own children been waiting for me to die? The coffee shop was nearly empty at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. Most people were at work or going about their normal lives, blissfully unaware that somewhere across town, a funeral was starting without the widow in attendance. Dean and I sat in a corner booth, the farthest spot from the windows, where no one could see us from the street. My hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. The ceramic was warm, but I felt cold all the way through to my bones. Dean sat across from me, his phone on the table between us like a piece of evidence in a criminal trial. Play it, I said, though every part of me dreaded what I was about to hear. Dean's finger hovered over the play button. Grandma, are you sure? Once you hear this, you can't unhear it. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He pressed play, and suddenly, the voices of my children filled the small space between us. She's taking too long to get ready, Michael's voice came through the tinny speaker, sharp with impatience. The service starts in 45 minutes. Maybe that's better, Sarah replied, and I could hear the cruel smile in her voice. Gives us more time to make sure everything's in place. Did you check the brake line? David's voice, my youngest son, the boy I'd tutored through algebra and driven to soccer practice 1,000 times, loosened it just enough, Michael answered. Won't fail immediately, but after a few miles of mountain roads. Well, accidents happen when people are grieving and distracted. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. Dean reached across the table and squeezed my other hand. The insurance will pay out fast for an accidental death, Sarah continued. And with Dad gone, she was going to leave everything to us anyway eventually. This just speeds up the timeline. Speeds up the timeline. The casual way she said it, like they were discussing a business merger instead of murdering their mother. I still think we could have waited, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe found a care facility. Michael cut him off. And spend thousands every month keeping her comfortable while our inheritance gets smaller? The medical bills from Dad's cancer already ate into the estate. We can't afford to wait years for her to die naturally. Besides, Sarah added with a laugh that made my blood run cold, she's been so dramatic about grief. Everyone will understand why she lost control of the car. Poor thing, just couldn't bear to live without her precious Roman. Dean stopped the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what I'd just heard. These were my children. I'd given birth to them, raised them, sacrificed for them. I'd stayed up all night when they were sick, celebrated their achievements, helped them through divorces and job losses and every crisis they'd ever faced, and they were planning to kill me for money. There's more, Dean said quietly. They talked about the will, about your assets. They already know how much everything is worth. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Dad mentioned $1.8 million, Dean said. Between the house, Grandpa Roman's life insurance, and your retirement accounts. $1,800,000. Not a fortune by some standards, but apparently enough to murder for. They've been planning this for a while, I said. And it wasn't a question. Dean nodded. Dad said something about having discussed it multiple times. And Aunt Sarah mentioned that they'd already contacted a lawyer about expediting the probate process. I closed my eyes, remembering the last few weeks of Roman's life. How my children had suddenly become so helpful, so present. Michael had insisted on taking over our financial accounts to reduce my stress. Sarah had started asking detailed questions about my will and life insurance policies. David had been researching grief counseling and senior support services. I'd thought they were being caring. I'd been grateful for their attention. They were preparing, I realized aloud. They were setting everything up while Roman was dying. There's something else, Dean said, his voice even quieter now. About Grandpa Roman. My heart stopped. What about him? Dean looked down at his hands. They said something about how convenient it was that his pain medication made him so confused toward the end. That it would have been problematic if he'd been alert enough to change his will or ask questions about the finances. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Roman had been unusually foggy in his final weeks, sleeping more than normal, sometimes not recognizing me when he woke up. The doctor had said it was normal for end-stage cancer patients, a combination of pain medication and the disease itself. But what if it wasn't normal? What if someone had been ensuring he stayed confused and compliant? They drugged him, I whispered. They kept him sedated so he couldn't interfere with their plans. I think so, Dean said, tears in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Grandma. I should have noticed something sooner. I should have protected you both. Oh, sweetheart, I said, reaching across to hold his hands. This isn't your fault. You're the only one who did protect us. My phone had been buzzing continuously on the table beside me. 16 missed calls now, with messages starting to pile up. I picked it up and began reading. Michael. Where are you? The service is starting. Sarah. Mom, please call. We're worried sick. David. Are you okay? Everyone is asking where you are. Michael. This is embarrassing. Dad wouldn't want you to miss his own funeral. The last message made me want to throw the phone across the room. They were using Roman's memory to manipulate me, even now. They're getting desperate, Dean observed. They probably figured out that their plan didn't work when you didn't show up at the funeral. What happens now? I asked. They'll come looking for me eventually. We need to be smart about this, Dean said. We can't just accuse them outright. They'll deny everything, say I misunderstood or made it up. And without more evidence than just this recording. He was right. The recording was damning, but it might not be enough. And if I confronted them now, while they were desperate and cornered, who knew what they might do next? We need to get back to the house before they do, I said, thinking quickly. I need to look through Roman's medical records, see if there's any evidence of what they did to him. And I need to check what Michael has been doing with our financial accounts. That's dangerous, Dean said. What if they come back while you're there? The funeral isn't over yet. They'll have to stay for the reception, play the part of grieving children. That gives us maybe 2 hours. Dean nodded slowly. Okay, but we go together. And if we hear them coming back, we leave immediately. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be today. A grieving widow, devastated and vulnerable. But underneath the surface, something was changing. The woman who had raised 3 children, who had nursed her husband through cancer, who had built a life through decades of hard work and sacrifice, was not going to be murdered for money. Not by her own children. Not by anyone. Dean, I said as we walked back toward the house, I need you to promise me something. Anything, Grandma? Whatever we find in that house, whatever evidence we discover, we're going to be very careful about how we use it. I won't let them destroy what your grandfather and I built together. And I won't let them get away with what they've done. He squeezed my arm. What are you thinking? I smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a woman who had underestimated her enemies, but who wouldn't make that mistake twice. I'm thinking they taught me exactly how ruthless I need to be. The house felt different when Dean and I slipped in through the back door. It was the same home I'd lived in for 23 years, the same kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, the same hallway lined with family photos, but now it felt like enemy territory, a place where my own children had plotted my death while I slept upstairs, unaware. We need to move fast, I whispered to Dean as we made our way to Roman's study. Check his desk while I look through the medical files. Roman had always been meticulous about paperwork. Every doctor visit, every prescription, every insurance claim was filed away in perfect chronological order in the metal filing cabinet beside his mahogany desk. If there was evidence of what my children had done to him, it would be there. I pulled out the folder marked Medical Final 6 Months and spread the contents across his desk. The progression was all there in black and white. Roman's pain medication had been increased 4 times in his last 8 weeks of life. Each increase had been requested by family members calling the doctor's office, claiming he was in unbearable pain and couldn't sleep. But I remembered those conversations differently. Roman had actually been managing his pain reasonably well until the final month. He'd been lucid, still himself, still the sharp-minded man I'd fallen in love with. It was only after Michael had started helping with his medication schedule that Roman became confused and distant. Grandma, Dean called softly from behind Roman's desk, you need to see this. He was holding a manila envelope with my name written across the front in Roman's careful handwriting. Underneath my name, in smaller letters, he'd written, to be opened only after my death, and only if something seems wrong. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter dated just 3 weeks before Roman died, along with several printed emails and what looked like bank statements. My dearest Phyllis, the letter began, and seeing his handwriting made my chest ache with fresh grief. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and something has happened that made you suspicious enough to look for this letter. I pray I'm wrong about what I suspect, but if I'm right, then this information may save your life. I had to stop reading for a moment to catch my breath. Roman had known. Somehow he'd known what our children were planning. I've been pretending to be more confused than I really am for the past few weeks, the letter continued. The medication they're giving me does make me drowsy, but I'm still aware of what's happening around me. I've heard things, Phyllis. Conversations between our children that no parent should ever have to hear. The room felt like it was spinning. Roman had been aware, had been listening, had been protecting us both even while fighting cancer. They think I don't remember the meeting they had in our bedroom while I was sleeping 2 weeks ago. Michael brought papers for me to sign, said they were medical directives. But I recognized Sarah's handwriting on the margins. They were financial documents, transfers of assets that would take effect immediately upon my death. They're planning to control everything before you even have time to grieve. I looked up at Dean, who was reading over my shoulder. His face was pale, but his jaw was set with determination. But that's not the worst part, Roman's letter went on. Yesterday, I overheard David on the phone with someone discussing the timeline for after I'm gone. He mentioned that you wouldn't be around long enough for it to matter anyway. The way he said it, Phyllis. It wasn't natural death he was expecting. My vision blurred with tears. Roman had spent his final weeks knowing our children were planning to kill me, and he'd been powerless to stop it directly. I've taken precautions, the letter continued. Hidden in this envelope, you'll find printed copies of emails between our children from the past month. I accessed them using Michael's laptop when he left it open in our living room. They discussed their plans in detail, including how they've been researching accidental death insurance payouts and how to avoid investigation. With trembling hands, I pulled out the printed emails. The first one was from Sarah to her brothers, dated 18 days ago. The old man is getting sicker faster than we expected, it read. This could actually work in our favor if we time things right. Mom will be vulnerable and grief-stricken. People will understand if she has an accident shortly after losing him. The next email was Michael's response. I've been researching insurance policies. Accidental death pays out faster and with fewer questions than natural death. We just need to make sure the timing looks right. Not so soon after Dad's funeral that it seems suspicious, but soon enough that she doesn't have time to change her will or start giving money away to charity. David had replied, I found information about brake line failures. Very difficult to trace, especially if the victim has been under stress and not maintaining the vehicle properly. I can handle the mechanical aspect. I felt sick reading my youngest son's clinical discussion of murdering me. David, who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who I'd held when he broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in our backyard. There's more, Dean said quietly, pointing to another email. This one was from Sarah, dated just 5 days before Roman died. We need to keep him sedated enough that he doesn't start asking questions about his accounts. I doubled his evening pain medication last night, told Mom the doctor had called with new instructions. He was so out of it this morning, he didn't even recognize her at first. Perfect. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. My children hadn't just been planning my death. They'd been slowly poisoning their father to keep him from interfering. The bank statements, I said, grabbing the remaining papers from the envelope. Roman said there were financial documents. The statements showed activity from the past 2 months that I didn't recognize. Small transfers, moved from our joint checking account to an account I'd never heard of. $2,500 here, $1,800 there. Amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice with all the medical bills and funeral expenses, but over 8 weeks they'd stolen more than $12,000. They've been skimming money, Dean said, adding up the figures. And look at this. They opened the new account using forged signatures. I flipped to the signature card stapled to the back of the statements. There was my signature and Roman's, except I'd never signed these documents. The handwriting was close, but not quite right. Sarah, I said immediately. She always had the best handwriting of the 3 kids. She used to forge my signature on school permission slips when she was in high school. Roman's letter continued for another page, detailing other suspicious conversations he'd overheard and changes in the children's behavior over the past few months. But it was the final paragraph that hit me hardest. Phyllis, my love, I wish I could protect you from this, but my time is running short. They're being very careful to make sure I stay too medicated to think clearly, and I'm not strong enough to fight both the cancer and them. But you are strong enough. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Don't let them destroy what we built together. Don't let them win. At the bottom of the letter, Roman had written one final instruction. Check the safe. The combination is our anniversary date. There's something there you'll need. I looked at Dean. Did you know about a safe? In their bedroom, he said. Behind the painting of the lake house. Grandpa showed it to me once when I was little. We made our way upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. Every creak of the floorboards made us freeze, listening for sounds of my children returning. But the house remained silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the minutes until the funeral reception would end, and they would come looking for me. The safe was exactly where Dean remembered, hidden behind the watercolor painting of the cabin where Roman and I had honeymooned. The combination lock turned easily when I entered our anniversary date, June 14th, 1985. Inside was a manila folder containing documents I'd never seen before. "What is it?" Dean asked as I pulled out the papers. I read the top document twice before I could believe what I was seeing. It was a new will, dated 1 week before Roman died, and properly notarized by his longtime lawyer, James Morrison. But this will was completely different from the one Roman and I had discussed. Instead of leaving everything to our children equally, this will established a trust. Dean would inherit 25% of our assets when he turned 21, and another 25% when he turned 30. The remaining 50% would go to the National Cancer Research Foundation. Our children would receive nothing. "He knew," I whispered. "Roman knew what they were planning, and he protected us both." But there was one more document in the folder that made my blood run cold. It was a photocopy of life insurance policies I didn't know existed. Policies that Michael had taken out on both Roman and me in the past 6 months, with himself, Sarah, and David listed as beneficiaries. The combined payout would be $800,000. "They insured us like livestock," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "They've been planning this for months, getting everything in place for when they murdered us both." Dean was reading over my shoulder, his young face twisted with disgust. "The dates on these policies. They applied for them right after Grandpa's cancer diagnosis got worse." A sound from downstairs made us both freeze. Car doors slamming, voices in the driveway. They were back. "Quick," I whispered, stuffing Roman's letter and the safe documents into my purse. "We need to get out of here." But as we crept toward the back staircase, I heard Michael's voice from the kitchen below. "Her car is still in the garage," he was saying. "So where the hell is she?" "Maybe she walked to a neighbor's house," Sarah replied. "She was always close to that Patterson woman next door." "No," David said, and I could hear the worry in his voice. "Something's wrong. She should have been in an accident by now. The brake line was definitely compromised." "Well, obviously something went wrong with your brilliant plan," Sarah snapped. "Now what do we do?" "We stick to the backup plan," Michael said, his voice cold and determined. "We find her, convince her she's too grief-stricken to be making decisions, and get her to sign the conservatorship papers. Once we have legal control, we can figure out a more permanent solution." They were talking about backup plans for my murder, standing in my kitchen, eating the casseroles that neighbors had brought to comfort our family. I looked at Dean and saw my own determination reflected in his young eyes. We had the evidence we needed. We had Roman's final gift to us, the truth about what our children had become. Now we just needed to survive long enough to use it. Dean and I managed to slip out the back door while my children argued in the kitchen about where I could have gone. We made it to Mrs. Patterson's house next door, where I'd spent countless afternoons over the years, sharing coffee and neighborhood gossip. Eleanor Patterson had been my closest friend since we moved to Maple Street, and when I knocked on her door with tears in my eyes, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled us inside. "Phyllis, dear, what on earth happened at the funeral?" Eleanor asked, settling us in her living room. "Michael called here 20 minutes ago asking if I'd seen you." He sounded frantic. "I need to use your phone," I said, pulling Roman's documents from my purse. "And I need you to witness something very important." For the next hour, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. First, I called James Morrison, Roman's lawyer, and asked him to meet us immediately at Eleanor's house. Second, I called the police non-emergency line to report suspected elder abuse and fraud. Third, I called my bank to freeze all accounts that Michael had access to. While we waited for Mr. Morrison to arrive, Dean and I explained everything to Eleanor. She listened with growing horror as we played the recording of my children planning my death and showed her the evidence Roman had gathered. "Those monsters," she whispered when we finished. "To think I've been bringing them casseroles and asking how they were holding up." They were planning to kill their own mother. James Morrison arrived within 40 minutes, his usually calm demeanor shaken when I showed him Roman's hidden will and the evidence of my children's plans. He confirmed that the will was legally valid, and that Roman had specifically instructed him not to reveal its existence until after the funeral. "Roman was very concerned about your safety, Phyllis," Mr. Morrison said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents. "He came to my office 3 weeks ago, quite agitated, insisting that we needed to change everything immediately. He said he'd discovered something that made him fear for your life." "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "He was afraid they might be monitoring your conversations. He said they'd become very controlling about his medication and who he was allowed to see. He wanted to protect you, but he also wanted to make sure there was legal proof of what they were doing." As if summoned by our conversation, the doorbell rang. Through Eleanor's front window, I could see Michael's Mercedes in the driveway. "They found us," Dean whispered. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Do you want me to tell them you're not here?" I thought for a moment, looking at Roman's letter in my hands, remembering his words about my strength. "No," I said finally. "It's time to face them." Eleanor opened the door to find all 3 of my children standing on her porch. They looked appropriately grief-stricken for anyone watching, but I could see the cold calculation in their eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," Michael said with forced politeness, "we're looking for our mother. We're very worried about her." "She missed Dad's funeral," Sarah added, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "We think she might be having some kind of breakdown." "She's here," I called from the living room before Eleanor could answer. "Come in. We need to talk." The 3 of them filed into Eleanor's living room, their expressions shifting from fake concern to confusion when they saw Mr. Morrison sitting beside me with legal documents spread across the coffee table. "Mom," David said carefully, "what's going on? We've been worried sick. Why didn't you come to the funeral?" "Sit down," I said, my voice steady and cold. "All of you." They exchanged glances but took seats on Eleanor's couch, facing me like defendants in a courtroom. "I know what you did," I said simply. "I know what you planned to do, and I know why I'm still alive." Michael's face went pale, but he tried to maintain his concerned son act. "Mom, you're not making sense. The stress of losing Dad—" "Stop," I interrupted, holding up Roman's letter. "I found this. Your father knew exactly what you were planning." Sarah leaned forward, trying to see what I was holding. "What is that?" "It's a letter from your father, detailing every conversation he overheard, every plan you made, every step you took to steal from us and plan our deaths." The mask slipped from Michael's face for just a moment, and I saw something cold and vicious underneath. "That's impossible. Dad was barely coherent in his last weeks. Because you drugged him," Dean spoke up from beside me, his young voice shaking with anger. "You overdosed him on pain medication to keep him quiet while you stole from their accounts and planned to kill Grandma." "Dean," David said, trying to sound reasonable, "you don't understand adult situations." "I understand murder," Dean shot back. "I recorded you this morning, talking about loosening the brake lines on Grandma's car." The silence that followed was deafening. My children stared at Dean, then at me, and I watched as their facades completely crumbled. Sarah was the first to recover. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was sharp now, defensive. "We've been taking care of both of you, sacrificing our time and energy." "Sacrificing?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've stolen over $12,000 from our accounts in the past 2 months. You took out life insurance policies on your father and me without our knowledge. You systematically poisoned Roman to keep him compliant. And this morning you sabotaged my car hoping I would die on the way to his funeral." Michael stood up abruptly, his face flushed red. "You ungrateful old woman. Do you have any idea how much we've had to put up with? Dad's medical bills, his constant complaining, your helplessness." "Michael!" David hissed, but it was too late. "No," Michael continued, his voice rising. "I'm tired of pretending. We've wasted months of our lives dealing with this mess. Dad should have died in a hospital where professionals could handle him, and you should be in a care facility where you can't make ridiculous accusations. Sarah tried to grab his arm to stop him, but Michael was past caring about appearances. We were trying to solve everyone's problems, he said, pacing Eleanor's small living room. You're both too old to manage money responsibly. The inheritance was going to be split 3 ways eventually anyway. We were just expediting the process. By murder, Mr. Morrison said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since my children arrived, and his words carried the weight of legal authority. It wasn't murder, David said desperately. It was. It would have been an accident. People die in car crashes every day. And Dad was dying anyway. So you helped him along, I said. You poisoned your own father. Sarah finally found her voice, and when she spoke, all pretense of grief was gone. He was suffering. We were being merciful. Merciful? I repeated. By drugging him so he couldn't think clearly enough to stop you from stealing from us? We weren't stealing, Sarah snapped. That money was going to be ours anyway. We were just accessing our inheritance early. Your inheritance, I said, reaching for the will Roman had hidden in the safe, doesn't exist anymore. I handed the document to Mr. Morrison, who cleared his throat and began to read. I, Roman Edward Carmichael, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. As Mr. Morrison read the terms of Roman's new will, the trust for Dean, the donation to cancer research, the complete disinheritance of my 3 children, I watched their faces transform from confusion to shock to rage. That's not possible, Michael said when Mr. Morrison finished reading. Dad wouldn't have done that. He was too confused, too medicated. The will was witnessed and notarized, Mr. Morrison said calmly. Roman was mentally competent when he signed it. I can attest to that personally. This is Dean's fault, Sarah said, turning on her nephew with vicious fury. You poisoned him against us. You manipulated a sick old man. I saved him, Dean said quietly. And I saved Grandma. David was staring at the will with something like disbelief. $800,000 to charity? 25% to Dean? Mom, you can't let this stand. You can contest it? Claim Dad was mentally incompetent? Why would I contest a will that protects my assets from 3 people who tried to murder me? I asked. We never tried to murder you, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and played the recording Dean had made that morning. Their own voices filled Eleanor's living room, discussing brake lines and insurance payouts, and making my death look accidental. When the recording ended, Michael's shoulders slumped in defeat. You don't understand the pressure we've been under. Our mortgages, our kids' college expenses, the economy. So you decided to solve your financial problems by killing your parents, I said. Is that what you're telling me? Sarah stood up, her face twisted with anger. You have no right to judge us. You and Dad lived through the easy times. Houses were cheap. Jobs were secure. You could raise a family on one income. We're drowning in debt while you sit on nearly $2 million that you'll never spend. $2 million that I earned through 40 years of work and careful saving, I replied. Money that your father and I plan to use for our retirement, our medical care, maybe some travel in our golden years. What golden years? David said bitterly. Dad's dead, and you're 63. How many years do you have left? 10? 15? Meanwhile, we're struggling to put food on the table for our families. I looked at my youngest son, remembering the little boy who used to make me Mother's Day cards with construction paper and glue. So you decided I didn't deserve those years. You decided to take them from me. We decided to be practical, Michael said, his voice cold. You're old, Mom. This is the natural order of things. Children inherit from parents. We just wanted to skip the part where we had to wait for you to die slowly in a nursing home. The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed and loved and sacrificed for, talking about murdering me like it was a reasonable business decision. Get out, I said quietly. Mom? David started. Get out of this house. Get out of my life. All of you. You can't cut us off completely, Sarah said, desperation creeping into her voice. We're your children. No, I said, standing up and facing the three people who had once been the most important things in my world. You're strangers who happen to share my DNA. My children died the moment you decided my life was worth less than your convenience. They left then, but not quietly. Michael slammed Eleanor's front door so hard that her china cabinet rattled. Sarah screamed at me from the driveway that I'd regret this decision. David just looked broken, like he was finally realizing the magnitude of what they'd tried to do. As we watched them drive away, Mr. Morrison began gathering up the legal documents. I'll file the police report about the insurance fraud and the theft from your accounts. With the evidence Roman gathered and Dean's recording, there should be enough for criminal charges. I nodded, but I felt hollow inside. We'd won, but the victory tasted like ash in my mouth. Grandma, Dean said softly, are you okay? I looked at my grandson, this brave young man who had saved my life and helped me uncover the truth. He would inherit a substantial sum when he came of age, but more than that, he'd inherit the knowledge that he'd done the right thing when it mattered most. I will be, I said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed it was true. 3 days after the confrontation at Eleanor's house, I did something my children would never expect. I called them and invited them to dinner. I've been thinking about what happened, I said, when Michael answered his phone. My voice carefully modulated to sound uncertain and fragile. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe we need to talk this through as a family. There was a long pause before he responded. Mom, are you feeling all right? I'm lonely, I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. This house feels so empty without your father. I keep thinking about what you said about the natural order of things, about families sticking together. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been selfish. I could practically hear the relief in his voice. I'm glad you're being reasonable. We never wanted to hurt you. We were just trying to plan for everyone's future. I know, I said, injecting just the right amount of resignation into my tone. Will you come to dinner on Saturday? All of you? Bring the grandchildren. I want to see the whole family together. Of course, Michael said quickly. Mom, I think this is the right choice. We can work everything out. After I hung up, Dean looked at me with concern. He'd been staying with me since the day of Roman's funeral, sleeping in the guest room and helping me process everything we'd discovered. Grandma, what are you planning? He asked. Justice, I said simply. Your grandfather spent his final weeks gathering evidence to protect us. Now we're going to use it. Over the next 3 days, I prepared for what would be the most important dinner party of my life. I called my sister Margaret, who lived 2 hours away in Columbus, and asked her to come for the weekend with her family. I invited Roman's brother William and his wife Helen. I reached out to cousins, longtime family friends, even some of the neighbors who had been close to Roman and me over the years. It's a memorial gathering, I explained to each of them, a chance to celebrate Roman's life with the people who loved him most. What I didn't tell them was that it would also be a reckoning. Mr. Morrison helped me prepare the legal documents we would need. He'd been in contact with the police about the insurance fraud and the theft from our accounts, and Detective Sarah Chen had assured us that charges would be filed once they completed their investigation. But I wanted more than criminal charges. I wanted my children to face the truth about what they'd done in front of the people who had watched them grow up. On Saturday afternoon, I spent hours cooking Roman's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, fresh dinner rolls, and apple pie for dessert. The house filled with the warm smells that had always meant family and love and safety. It felt like a cruel irony, preparing a feast for people who had wanted me dead. Dean helped me set the table in our formal dining room, the one we usually reserved for holidays and special occasions. I used our wedding china, the delicate blue and white pattern that Roman had surprised me with on our 10th anniversary. Are you sure about this? Dean asked as we folded napkins and placed them beside each plate. I'm sure, I said. Your grandfather always believed that the truth should be spoken clearly and without apology. That's what we're going to do tonight. The first guests to arrive were Margaret and her family. My sister took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. Phyllis, she said after her husband and teenage daughters had gone into the living room. What's really going on? You sounded strange on the phone. You'll understand everything soon, I promised her. But Margaret, I need you to know that whatever happens tonight, Dean and I are safe now. Her eyes widened with alarm, but before she could ask more questions, Roman's brother William arrived with Helen. Then came the neighbors, the family friends, the cousins I hadn't seen in months. By 6 o'clock, the house was full of people who had genuinely cared about Roman and who, I hoped, still cared about me. Michael, Sarah, and David arrived together at 6:15, their children in tow. My grandchildren, Michael's twins Emily and Jake, Sarah's daughter Sophie, and David's son Marcus, were confused by all the company but excited to see their cousins. "Mom," Sarah said, pulling me aside in the kitchen. "I thought this was going to be just family." "It is family," I replied. "Everyone here loved your father." Michael looked around the crowded living room with barely concealed irritation. "This seems like a lot of people for a private discussion." "Oh, we'll have our private discussion," I assured him. "After dinner." The meal itself was surreal. I sat at the head of the table where Roman used to sit, watching my children make small talk with relatives and neighbors, playing the parts of grieving siblings who were supporting their widowed mother. They were good at it, I had to admit. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have believed they were genuinely concerned about my welfare. Margaret sat to my right, William to my left. Dean sat directly across from me, his steady presence giving me strength. My 3 children were scattered around the table with their families, probably trying to avoid being seated together in case they needed to present a united front later. "Roman would have loved this," Helen said during a pause in the conversation. "He always said that food tastes better when it's shared with people you love." "He did say that," I agreed. "He also used to say that the most important thing in life was family trust, that once you lost that, you'd lost everything." I saw Michael and Sarah exchange a quick glance across the table. "Dad was always full of wisdom like that," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, he was," I said. "In fact, he left behind quite a bit of wisdom for all of us, some of it written down." After dinner, I served coffee and pie in the living room while the grandchildren played in the backyard. When everyone was settled with their dessert, I stood up in front of the fireplace where Roman and I had exchanged our wedding vows 23 years ago. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I began. "Roman would have been touched to see so many people who cared about him gathered in our home." There were murmurs of agreement around the room. As many of you know, Roman was a careful man, a thorough man. He believed in preparation, in making sure his family would be taken care of no matter what happened to him. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah stared at her coffee cup. "Before he died, Roman left me some documents. Letters, actually. Letters that he wanted me to share with all of you, so you would understand what kind of man he really was." I pulled Roman's letter from the manila envelope I'd placed on the mantel earlier. This is dated 3 weeks before Roman's death. He was very sick, but his mind was completely clear when he wrote it. "Mom," Michael said, starting to stand up, "maybe this should be private." "Sit down," I said firmly, and something in my voice made him obey. "Everyone here loved your father. They have a right to hear his final words." I began to read Roman's letter aloud, starting with his explanation of how he'd been pretending to be more confused than he really was. The room grew completely silent as I read his account of overhearing our children's conversations, their plans to control our finances, their casual discussion of my death. Margaret gasped audibly when I read the part about the insurance policies. William's face grew dark with anger. The neighbors and family friends sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. "This can't be true," Helen whispered. "Unfortunately it is," I said, and I nodded to Dean. He pulled out his phone and played the recording he'd made the morning of Roman's funeral. My children's voices filled the living room, discussing brake lines and insurance payouts, and making my death look accidental. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret was staring at her nephews and niece with horror. "How could you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How could you plan to kill your own mother?" "It's not what it sounds like," Sarah said desperately, looking around the room at the faces of people who had known her since childhood. They're taking everything out of context. Context? William stood up, his face flushed with rage. What context makes it acceptable to plan your mother's murder? We weren't trying to murder anyone, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were discussing hypotheticals. Hypothetical brake line failures? I asked. Hypothetical insurance payouts? Hypothetical timelines for my death? Eleanor Patterson, who had witnessed everything at her house 3 days ago, shook her head sadly. I've known these children since they were babies. I can't believe what they've become. The worst part, I continued, is that they started implementing their plan while Roman was still alive. They overdosed him on pain medication to keep him confused and compliant. They stole money from our accounts. They took out life insurance policies on both of us without our knowledge. I handed copies of the bank statements and insurance documents to Margaret and William. As they read, their expressions grew increasingly horrified. $800,000, Margaret said, staring at the insurance policies. You insured your parents like property. Michael finally found his voice, and when he spoke, all pretense was gone. You have no idea what it's like, he said, his tone bitter and defensive. Watching your parents hoard money while your own children can't afford college. Knowing that millions of dollars are just sitting there while we struggle to pay our mortgages. So you decided to kill us for it, I said flatly. We decided to be practical, Sarah snapped, apparently forgetting that the room was full of witnesses. You're old. Dad was dying anyway. We were just trying to solve everyone's problems efficiently. The gasps and exclamations from around the room seemed to finally penetrate her awareness. She looked around at the shocked faces of relatives and neighbors, realizing too late that she'd just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder in front of 20 witnesses. Sarah, David hissed, but it was too late. You solved your problems, all right, I said. You solved them permanently. I reached for the final document I'd prepared, the one that would end this chapter of my life forever. Roman left behind one more surprise for you, I announced. A new will, properly witnessed and notarized, that he signed 1 week before his death. In it, he left 25% of our assets to Dean when he turns 21, another 25% to him when he turns 30, and 50% to the National Cancer Research Foundation. The 3 of you inherit nothing. The color drained from Michael's face. That's not possible. He was too sick to make legal decisions. Mr. Morrison can attest to his mental competency, I said, but it doesn't matter now anyway, because I've decided to honor Roman's wishes completely. I held up the document I'd signed that morning. This is my own new will, which mirrors your father's exactly. Dean will inherit from me when the time comes. The 3 of you will not. You can't do this, Sarah said, desperation making her voice shrill. We're your children. No, I said, looking at each of them in turn. You stopped being my children the moment you decided I was worth more dead than alive. You're strangers to me now. David was crying, which surprised me. Mom, please. We made a mistake, but we're still family. Family doesn't try to murder each other for money, William said disgustedly. Roman was right to cut you out. Margaret stood up and came to stand beside me. Phyllis, you're welcome to come stay with us for as long as you need. You shouldn't be alone in this house. Thank you, I said. But I'm not alone. I have Dean. I looked at my grandson, this brave young man who had saved my life and helped me uncover the truth. He would be the only one to carry on the family name with honor. I think it's time for this gathering to end, I announced. For those of you who truly cared about Roman, thank you for coming. For those of you who didn't, I looked directly at my 3 children. Please leave my house and don't come back. As the legitimate guests began to file out, offering hugs and promises to stay in touch, Michael made one last, desperate attempt. Mom, you'll regret this. When you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you, we won't be there. I smiled at him, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. I'm counting on it. After everyone else had gone, Dean and I sat in the quiet living room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and pie plates. The house felt peaceful for the first time since Roman's death. "Do you think Grandpa would be proud of us?" Dean asked. I thought about Roman's letter, about his final words telling me I was strong enough to fight for what we'd built together. "I think he's finally at peace," I said, "and so am I." 6 months after that final dinner party, I was sitting on the front porch of my new home in Millfield, a small town about 60 miles from where Roman and I had spent most of our married life. The house was smaller than our old place, but perfect for my needs. 2 bedrooms, a sunny kitchen, and a garden where I could grow the tomatoes and roses that Roman had always loved. Dean sat beside me on the porch swing, working on homework for his junior year of high school. He'd transferred to Millfield High when we moved, and despite my worries about uprooting him, he'd adjusted beautifully. He was even playing on the soccer team, something he'd never had time for when he was busy protecting me from his father and aunts. "Letter came from Mr. Morrison today," I said, holding up the official envelope that had arrived with the afternoon mail. Dean looked up from his history textbook. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news," I said, opening the envelope. "The criminal trial is scheduled for next month. All 3 of them are going to plead guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges." The police investigation had moved quickly once Detective Chen had all the evidence Roman had gathered. The insurance fraud alone was enough to send my children to prison, but the recorded conversation about sabotaging my car had sealed their fate. Their lawyers had advised them that fighting the charges would only result in longer sentences. "How long?" Dean asked. "Michael gets 5 years for being the ringleader. Sarah and David each get 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months for cooperation." I felt nothing as I read the sentences. No satisfaction, no sadness, just a kind of empty closure. These people had once been the center of my world, but they'd chosen money over family, greed over love. The justice system would handle them now. "There's something else," I said, pulling out a second document from the envelope. "The civil lawsuit settled. The insurance company is paying the full $800,000 in damages for the fraudulent policies your father and aunts took out." Dean whistled softly. "That's a lot of money." "It is," I agreed. "And I've decided what to do with it. I'd been thinking about this for months, ever since Mr. Morrison first told me about the insurance payout. The money felt tainted, earned through my children's attempt to profit from my death. I didn't want it for myself. "I'm setting up a scholarship fund at the community college," I said, "for students who've aged out of foster care or who don't have family support. Dean Carmichael Scholarship Fund." Dean blushed and ducked his head. "Grandma, you don't have to name it after me." "Yes, I do," I said firmly. "You're the only member of our family who acted with honor when it mattered. Your grandfather would want his name associated with helping young people who have to make their own way in the world, just like you did." It was true. Dean had essentially been on his own since he was 14, when his father Michael became so obsessed with money and inheritance that he stopped being a real parent. Dean had raised himself, and he'd done a better job than any of my children had managed with all their advantages. The scholarship would provide full tuition and living expenses for 2 students per year, renewable for up to 4 years. Mr. Morrison had helped me structure it so that it would continue long after I was gone, funded by the insurance settlement and a portion of my own estate. "Have you heard from any of them?" Dean asked quietly. He never used their names anymore. They were just them, or they, the people who used to be our family. "Sarah writes from jail sometimes," I said, asking me to forgive her, promising she's learned her lesson. I don't respond. The letters arrived every few weeks, written on prison stationery in Sarah's careful handwriting. They were full of apologies and excuses, explanations about financial pressure and momentary lapses in judgment. She seemed to genuinely believe that what they'd done was just a mistake, a temporary madness that could be forgiven and forgotten. I read each letter once and then threw it away. Some things couldn't be forgiven, not because I wasn't capable of forgiveness, but because forgiving them would require me to pretend that attempting to murder your mother for money was somehow understandable. "What about Michael and David?" "Nothing," I said. "Michael's too proud to apologize and David's too ashamed. I think that's for the best." A car pulled into our driveway, Eleanor Patterson's blue Honda. She'd been driving down to visit us every other weekend since we moved, claiming she needed to make sure we were settling in properly. Really, I think she was as lonely as we were. "Phyllis!" she called, getting out of the car with a covered dish in her hands. "I brought that casserole you like, and some news from the old neighborhood." Eleanor had become our connection to our former life, bringing us updates about neighbors and mutual friends. Most of the news was ordinary: who was selling their house, whose grandchildren were visiting, which gardens were thriving despite the unseasonably dry summer. "Mrs. Chen wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to her police training class," Eleanor said as she settled into the wicker chair across from our porch swing, "about recognizing elder abuse and financial crimes. She says your case has become a teaching example." I considered this. Detective Chen had been thorough and compassionate throughout the investigation, treating me like a victim rather than a foolish old woman who should have seen the signs sooner. "I think I'd like that," I said, "if it helps other families avoid what we went through." "And there's other news," Eleanor continued, her expression growing more serious. "The old house sold." I felt a small pang at this announcement, though I'd known it would happen eventually. The house where Roman and I had been happy, where we'd raised our children and celebrated holidays and built a life together, had been sold to pay the children's legal fees and restitution to the insurance company. "Who bought it?" "Young couple with twin babies," Eleanor said. "The husband is a doctor, the wife is a teacher. They seem lovely. They're already talking about putting in a playground in the backyard." I smiled at this. The house would have children again. Laughter and noise and the chaos of family life. Maybe this new family would be everything that mine had failed to be. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. As the sun began to set behind the maple trees that lined our street, Eleanor headed back to her car. Dean went inside to shower and start dinner. He'd become an excellent cook in the months since we'd moved, taking over many of the household responsibilities without being asked. I stayed on the porch swing, rocking gently as the evening air cooled around me. This time of day had always been my favorite, the quiet hour when work was done and the evening stretched ahead with its promise of rest and contentment. My phone buzzed with a text message. I expected it to be Margaret, checking in as she did every few days, but instead it was from a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Carmichael. This is Jessica from the Dean Carmichael Scholarship Fund. I wanted you to know that we've selected our first 2 recipients. Would you like to meet them?" I smiled and typed back. I would love that. The scholarship fund was already becoming more than I'd hoped. Jessica Martinez, the young woman I'd hired to administer it, had reached out to high schools and social service agencies throughout the county. The applications that had come in were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Young people who had survived abuse, abandonment, and poverty, but still believed in education and opportunity. Our first 2 recipients were Marcus Thompson, 18, who had been in foster care since he was 12 and wanted to study automotive technology, and Elena Rodriguez, 19, who had been supporting her younger siblings since their mother died and dreamed of becoming a nurse. "Grandma?" Dean called from inside the house. "Dinner's ready." I stood up from the porch swing, taking one last look at the peaceful street where we'd built our new life. Tomorrow, I would meet the first students who would benefit from the fund that bore Dean's name. Next week, I would speak to Detective Chen's training class about recognizing the signs of elder abuse. Next month, I would testify at my children's sentencing hearing, not to ask for leniency, but to make sure the judge understood the full extent of what they'd planned. But tonight, I would have dinner with my grandson, the brave young man who had saved my life and helped me discover the truth. We would talk about his soccer games and his upcoming SAT tests and his plans for college. We would watch the evening news together and maybe a movie afterward. It was a simple life, but it was ours. We had each other, we had our health, and we had the satisfaction of knowing that we'd fought for what was right and won. As I walked toward the kitchen where Dean was setting the table for 2, I thought about Roman's letter, his final words about my strength, and his confidence that I could protect what we'd built together. He'd been right. I had protected it. But more than that, I'd transformed it. The money that my children had killed for was now helping young people build better lives. The house where they'd plotted my death was now home to a family that understood what love really meant. The inheritance they'd coveted was now serving a purpose they could never have imagined. "Smells wonderful," I said as I entered the kitchen, breathing in the aroma of Dean's homemade chicken and dumplings. "Grandpa's recipe," he said with a smile. "I found it in his cookbook." We sat down at our small table, and Dean reached across to take my hand for grace. It was a tradition Roman had started when Dean was little, and we'd continued it even after everything changed. "Thank you for this food," Dean said, "for our new home, and for keeping us safe and together." "Amen," I whispered. As we ate dinner and talked about our day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. The nightmare was over. The people who had wanted to hurt us were facing justice. The money they'd tried to steal was being used for good, and I was finally, truly free. Outside our kitchen window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere among them, I like to think, Roman was watching over us and smiling. His family, the real family, the one defined by love rather than blood, was safe and happy and whole. After dinner, Dean and I sat in our small living room, he with his homework and me with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street outside. At 9 o'clock, Dean kissed my cheek and headed upstairs to bed. "Good night, Grandma. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." I stayed up a little longer, finishing my chapter and thinking about the day ahead. Tomorrow was Sunday, and we'd drive to the community college to meet Marcus and Elena, the first recipients of our scholarship fund. They would never know the full story of how their education was being funded, but that was fine. What mattered was that they would have the chance to build the lives they dreamed of, free from the financial desperation that had driven my children to such terrible choices. Before I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my own bedroom, I stopped at the small table by the front door where I kept Roman's picture. He was smiling in the photo, his eyes bright with the warmth and humor I'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. "We did it," I whispered to his image. "We protected what we built. We kept Dean safe, and we're going to help other people build something good too." I touched my fingers to my lips, then to the picture frame. "Thank you for your letter. Thank you for showing me how to be strong." Then I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, where I would sleep peacefully for the first time since Roman's diagnosis. The war was over, and we had won, not through violence or revenge, but through truth and justice, and the unbreakable bond between a grandmother and the grandson who had saved her life. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new opportunities to help others, new ways to honor Roman's memory. But tonight, there was only peace, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed and a future secured. Dean was safe. The scholarship fund would help deserving students for generations to come, and I was free to live whatever years remained to me on my own terms, surrounded by people who truly loved me. It was more than enough. It was everything. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.